It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me. My name's Eddy Pieniazek. I'm the head of advisory at Ishka. I'm here to provide you with a short reminder of why we're here and how we need to stay alert when we're investing in aircraft. I don't know how many people here are maybe new to investing in aviation, but between myself and Peter, we'll try to cover some of the salient points of investing in aircraft. Ishka itself is a 3-year-old business, but the people within the business have a long pedigree of 35, maybe 40 years worth of providing advisory, data and analytics to investors in aircraft. Some of the key points I thought I'd try and cover just to highlight why aviation should be of interest to investors. Aircraft are mobile assets. They can be redeployed quite easily, unlike various infrastructure elements. That's always been an attractive focus for aviation. Aircraft are also traceable and quite easily traceable. There's lots of mechanisms available now, the technology is there to be able to identify your assets and keep a track on them. And there's also global rights recognition, so a lot of security and regulation behind the ownership of assets as well. The long-term demand is there. We've seen that over many years now, many decades. The growth in traffic and the demand for aircraft. Aircraft are also tradable. They're quite liquid, so a lot of assets have been traded for many years now. I joined the industry in 1982, and at the time we were basically watching aircraft trading, and the mechanisms involved in trading have evolved over time since then. There's also a variety of different aircraft types, and that would satisfy different investment criteria, from wide bodies through narrow bodies, regional jets, freighters, turboprops. They all have different dynamics in the market, and each different dynamic satisfies different investors. New aircraft, they have a different profile in terms of investment. People get involved in used aircraft, mid-life aircraft, end-of-life aircraft. These are all different facets that people can get involved in. And whether it's a long-haul or a short-haul aircraft. And again, understanding the market helps you identify which types to get involved in. They have useful economic lives of, I think, 25 years. There's been a bit of debate in recent years as to whether that's shortening or lengthening. Overall, the figure seems to hover around the 25-year mark, although I guess in terms of primary useful life, you might be looking at 15, 16, 17 years, after which there are various options come available. Also, in terms of high-yield bonds, I mean, aircraft can be secured against an asset with the above properties, so they're similar to high-yield bonds but secured. And finally, they provide stable cash flows. With the leasing market being quite active these days, that stable cash flow is an attractive proposition. So again, in terms of where the aircraft are flying and where the demand is going to be, again, this is a chart that shows some of the data from the forecast from Airbus and Boeing, and the growth is there. Recently we've had some very strong growth. The forecast for the next 20 years continues that, between 4 and 5% per annum traffic growth. Different areas of the world will have different growth profiles. And again, that will influence the type of aircraft that people will choose in terms of where the investments are and which ones are going to prove to be more popular. In terms of traffic demand, I mean, the chart on the left is always a useful one. This measures RPKs, or revenue passenger kilometres, against the available passenger kilometres. As long as the traffic is growing faster than the seats being added to the market, that's usually a good thing. The load factors will increase, and it gives more opportunity for the airlines to make profits. And on the right-hand chart, this is from IATA, and that just shows 3 different profiles of how the traffic growth might develop going forwards, depending on 3 different scenarios. The lowercase one is if there's more protectionism and there's more restrictions on travel, there's still a lot of growth in there. The constant policies is basically the status quo and carrying forward today's policies. But if there's even more liberalisation in the market, the expectation is that the growth will be maybe 3.5 times where it is today. So even in a more conservative environment, there is still the propensity to travel and traffic growth. So demand for aircraft seems to be a given. And in terms of the fleet increases, it's not just about growth. There are aircraft in the fleets today which need replacing. Chart on the left just shows that the expectations from Airbus in terms of the next 20 years is another 37,000 aeroplanes, some of which will be needed to replace the existing fleet, some of which will be for growth. And on the right-hand chart, we're just showing in the last few years where those aircraft have gone. And about 40% of it has gone into the Asia-Pacific market, which has been growing quite steadily. Another 40% is split between Europe and North America, and other regions of the world have grown as well. The Middle East is obviously started to capture a larger share of that. So in terms of investing, the one thing this chart probably shows you is that investors have a choice. There are different ways of being involved in asset ownership. On the left-hand side, some of the more traditional mechanisms in terms of commercial bank lending, dealing with the airlines directly. The middle block, the asset-based leasing is a major component in there as well. And there are different structures that take advantage of various financial structures. And on the capital market side, something that's evolved over the last maybe 20 years or so, what's called the asset-backed securitization market in WTCs. In the course of any given year, there's probably $140 billion worth of aircraft being delivered this year. That's going to grow maybe towards 180 billion in a few years' time. So the need for financing is there, and these different structures have evolved in order to enable people to work with their own strategies and find a way of being involved. In fact, on the ABS side, I think last year we had about 18 different ABS structures created. It's about $8 billion worth of investment there. So there's lots of new ways of getting involved. And on the airline side, we hear of the occasional airline failure here and there, but in recent years, the number of airline failures has been quite low. So despite the fluctuations in fuel prices, airlines have managed their way through that particular environment. And we've seen relatively few airline failures. So they've all learned the market discipline of how to try and adapt. It's not an easy business, it's quite competitive, but the airlines seem to be managing their way through that, and some of the record profits from the airlines in recent years is testimony to that. But like with any other investment, you have to do your homework, because there are risks out there. Not every deal is a simple, straightforward deal, and it helps to understand what some of the complications are, some of the challenges. So, for example, each aircraft deal involves a fair amount of investment. A narrow body is in the order of 50 million, a wide body could be 90 to 150, the A380 is $200 million plus. So these are all fairly large investments. There's the credit risk, there's the airline behind the aircraft, and there's also the release risk if you're looking in the leasing market. So, where does the aircraft go after its first lease? Is it easy to find a second lease? There are other supply and demand influences. There's a wide spectrum of factors involved there in terms of just understanding where the route networks are going, where the airlines wish to operate, where the passenger flows need to be, and having the right aircraft for that right mission as well. And the values of these assets, they will fluctuate with the market, with the supply and demand. And perhaps one of the things that we've been asked to get involved in more recently is understanding this lack of transparency. There's amount of data that the market wants to see in terms of what our aircraft actually trade at in terms of pricing. The compensation there is that the industry offers a slightly higher yield that allows that to be mitigated. So in terms of choosing an aircraft, there's various different selection of factors here. You're looking at the market, you're looking at liquidity, you're looking at how popular the aircraft is. On the performance side, you're looking at the specifications. There are very technical nuances there in terms of the takeoff weight, in terms of the engine thrust. Different aircraft have different performances, even from within the same family of aircraft. So again, understanding these issues, knowing how marketable your aircraft is, knowing that there is a use of that airplane going forwards over that 15 to 25 year life. And there are more specific factors when you're looking at the actual individual aeroplanes. You look at the technical issues, like technical documentation, the maintenance status. These are all issues that need to be kept in mind. And in terms of monitoring the investment, aircraft aren't necessarily a buy and leave. It's a case of monitoring the asset, because the airlines They'll be running the aircraft will be using them at the time. You need to make sure that the aircraft's being looked after. And there are various ways that is done. The leasing companies themselves, they will manage their aircraft quite carefully. They will also do that on behalf of other parties. There are independent companies out there who will also monitor the asset on your behalf. It's always worth staying on top of the aircraft and having it monitored. Quite often in the past we've been involved in looking at aircraft that haven't been monitored, and it's usually a difficult case of trying to reconstruct aircraft, its technical records, its carrying out maintenance. It's usually best to stay on top of the situation. In terms of values, we've been working with a number of appraisers together. They provide us with what they call consensus values. So it's 5 appraisers. We average their numbers and we can plot the graphs and see how these different appraisers are approaching the asset values. And for the single aisle aircraft, such as 737s and Airbus A320s, these are typically good assets. Creditworthiness of the operators, quite often they are startups, so they may not be as strong as the major carriers, and there are shorter leases, but these are very flexible aircraft that are quite easily remarketable. The twin aisle aircraft, again, is slightly less liquid market, but the operators tend to be more credible, the leases tend to be longer, and there's a bit more security in that stable cash flow. So again, there are different facets to the aircraft that are available out there. And with the consensus views, the appraisers, what we tend to see is they have a fairly narrow band on some aircraft types in terms of the range of the spread of values amongst them. And that tends to be a good thing, I suspect, where there's a narrow range, because it's obviously a market where there's data that they can all work together. There's a bit more confidence in their future outlook. So for example, the Airbus A320s there and the Boeing 737 MAX, there's a very narrow spread in how the appraisers see the future values. And therefore there's a little bit more confidence there in terms of how the market is being read. But there are also differing opinions, which is interesting to see, because that suggests there's a little bit more analysis needed to be done in terms of understanding the assets. So these are some of the other aircraft types where the range of spread of values between them, not just in terms of current values, but also future values, is quite wide. You'll see for the A380 there, for example, there's a very large spread in where people see that future value will be in 10 years' time. That's not to say it's not an asset that shouldn't be invested in. It's an asset that needs to be understood, and the risk needs to be priced into any transaction. And that was the metal. In terms of the airlines themselves, in terms of their credit risk, we are tracking about 90 airlines now at the moment in terms of their credit profiles. These are airlines that people are heavily investing in at the moment. And some of the immediate observations in terms of, on the left-hand side, what we call full-service carriers. So these are some of the major carriers in the marketplace. And on the right-hand side, we have low-cost carriers. And just comparing some of their results collectively from 2016 to 2017, you can see that they're performing in different ways. The margins, the EBITDA margins, and the load factors much higher on the low-cost carriers, whereas the yields are stronger with the full-service carriers. So there's different dynamics again going on in the marketplace, something that we're analysing closely. And again, different appetites, different investment appetites can be managed through that process. And we have an outlook that we produce every year. We look at 10 major metrics in the industry. And what our outlook for 2019 is relatively positive. I guess in terms of issues that are based on the current market situation, I think we have two factors which are positive, another 2 which are strong, another 3 which are stable. There's a few negative ones, or on negative watch, where we're looking more closely at some of the issues that are happening there. Aircraft values we're keeping a close eye on, and the airline health as well. The fuel prices has come down recently, which is supporting some of the airlines, but it's also a competitive market as well. So there's lots of different airline strategies out there, some of which will be working better than others based on market conditions. So to conclude, aircraft have been a good investment. We've seen a lot of people very happy with the kind of returns and the yields that they've been getting. But looking forwards, I think there needs to be a focus and specialisation. So not all assets are the same, not all airlines are the same, and if you understand the credit risk at the same time. It's a good place to be, understanding what type of aircraft you're dealing with, what kind of age, what kind of sector it's operating in, the kind of marketability and liquidity. And then also some smart use of technology. We hear about the Internet of Things, we hear about blockchain. There are going to be better ways of managing the financial structures. And then finally on the analytics front, there's a lot of new ways of supporting the data and the modelling that needs to go on in terms of understanding the market. Digital twin modelling, for example. Quantifying that risk and reward. It's a never-ending process. We've learned a lot over the years in terms of understanding the data and what it means to investors. That's it from me, I think. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
On the last slide, can you give some specific examples about technology and AI, how they will help with aircraft leasing?
Thank you.
I think there the focus is really mainly on being able to do analytics and crunching data. Part of that is looking at transaction data, looking at how aircraft prices have moved, and then understanding what that depreciation curve is for assets. There's a lot of data that can be processed. There's also lots of data to do with traffic forecasts and route development. There's a lot of labour-intensive work involved there. Artificial intelligence helps you get that data processed faster and quicker. And also some of the machine learning that will go into that space as well. I think we're at the early stages of that in terms of how aviation will treat it. But there's also processes and developments in place now. There's an outfit called GIAS, again looking at blockchain technology in terms of trying to make an aircraft transaction itself, the process of the transaction, much more efficient in terms of process. So I think blockchain is something that everybody is looking at, and I suspect that will probably come true in the coming years. But really, it's just a case of there's a lot of data there that needs to be not just mined but also processed and analysed, so everybody can be a bit more confident with the assets.
Thank you. Any more questions? Dear guests, I'm kind of asking you to introduce yourself, so our speakers to be able to understand with whom they're talking. Thank you.
It's Mark Parker with Zeb Solutions. We're actually an aviation startup, so we're coming at this from a slightly different perspective. But my question would be, how do you see aircraft maintenance playing a role in the kind of return you get on the investment? We talked a little bit about in terms of management and going forward, but obviously I would think that plays a big role in the future value of the aircraft in terms of how well it's been maintained and how that varies internationally.
It's a short question with perhaps a day and a half answer. It's, I mean, the maintenance issue is probably one of the key ones going forwards. You see aircraft today that have reached maybe say 12 years of age, and depending upon where they are in their maintenance condition, it almost becomes a binary decision as whether you scrap the aircraft or put it through maintenance and continue its life. Maintenance is important as the aircraft gets older. It becomes a larger part of the value of the asset, to the point where once an aircraft reaches a certain age, say 17 years of age, its value is probably primarily in its maintenance status. So if it has enough time left to the next overhaul, 3-4 years maybe, then that's where the value sits. So it's important to be on top of the maintenance picture all the time, not just in terms of where it stands between its overhauls and its service life, but also the technical documentation that supports that as well. That's a short answer to the question, but yes, it's a major part of the asset's value, and it increases over time, and especially so with the engines. I think by the time you get to 15 years of age, almost all the value is in where the engines are sitting.
Thank you. Dear guests, we have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Bartlett with Code Aero. I have discussed with many airlines recently and analyzed also a lot of airline startups. The question I would have out of your experience, we find a lot of interest by the airlines to take over the control of the the aircraft. So aircraft financing in that model means that the airline financing its own aircraft versus there are aircraft lessors out there. And KPMG last year said it's 3 to 4% return on the aircraft investments, was sometimes higher, but very often also negative return. So how do you see that development from your point of view? Is that more the future of the aircraft lessor outside the airline, or is it the aircraft lessor inside the airline?
That's an interesting observation, and I mean, this market is dynamic. We went through a phase, maybe the last sort of 5, 10, 15 years, where the airlines weren't making as much profits as they are today, and the leasing model was much more valuable to them because it allowed them to access the assets without having that balance sheet exposure. More recently, the airlines have been making profits and they are sitting on cash, and they're finding that they try to spread their risk and put more aircraft on their balance sheets. It also helps their credit rating as well by having collateral within the airline. So these levels of interest will move up and down. I mean, at the moment, I think the leasing industry services or manages maybe 40% of the airline's fleet. And probably this seems to have plateaued at that level. And again, part of the reason is because the airlines have the cash to fund their own aircraft. And I think if the airlines have that opportunity, they will spread that risk. They will diversify. So they will own some assets, they will lease some assets, they will finance some assets. And again, that's just a way of mitigating their exposure to any one particular sector. If you're a startup, it tends to be leased aircraft. Again, just purely from a cash flow issue. Startups, generally speaking, don't have that kind of collateral behind them, that kind of cash behind them. So leasing is a good entry point. But if you've got the cash, then you can play those different areas. And as I showed before, compared to buying aircraft and cash flow, there are lots of other structures and mechanisms for owning aircraft. Just in case you find the one that suits your own particular pocket and your own particular strategy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Eddy.
Just a bit of background about our company. One of the reasons we feel that we have a voice within this sector is our independence. So we don't have any specific interest in a manufacturer, a particular deal. We are really trying to take the role of advising people and providing them with the tools to make their own decisions. So that objectivity leads into the kind of build-up we've had in a wide range of data, and we've developed databases that relate to the airline, they relate to the aircraft, they relate to the operations. So by putting those together, as Eddy mentioned, you can start to understand the way in which these assets are providing a return. The databases we've got go back to 1965, so we're covering the whole of the commercial sector and also the business sector, helicopters and so on. So we get that overall perspective on the industry. We've got about 30 people spread across 3 offices. We've got another office in Tokyo as well. But it means that we do get feedback from the marketplace in all those different time zones, and we have people that are dealing with specialisms in particular types of aircraft or helicopters or business jets and so on. So we are able to provide advice across the whole spectrum. What I'd like to talk to today is something about the aviation growth cycle, as Eddy mentioned, that it hasn't been without bumps in the past. And in fact, if I think back 20 years or so, then certainly you had a time when the airlines had burnt more money than they'd ever earned, which was not a good situation for a growth industry. Now that has been stabilised to a large extent, and we've seen a profitable industry over the last 4 or 5 years, and it's looking now that that kind of stability moving forward will actually provide a base for investors across the business. looking at our current position in the cycle, what the finance demand is, something about a couple of products that we've got, one of which is the Ascend Leasing Returns Index, and making a number of comparisons as to the returns on different kinds of assets, mentioning the credit risk and the asset risk, and then drawing a few conclusions. Just in terms of the sheer scale, you can see the growth levels of this industry, the number of deliveries, the scale of the total in-service aircraft, around 25,000, and the firm order backlog. There has been a theme that, well, surely the industry is ordering far too many planes. But actually, if you look at those demand forecasts and you project forward the fleet, then it does actually equate to around 7% or so of the fleet coming in each year. And that is a stable basis moving forward for the kind of levels of 4 to 5% traffic growth that we're expecting. And this is something that again shows, despite those bumps in the road that we've had, if you're looking at the growth of global GDP, you've seen it's grown around 3.5 times over that period from 1980. You've seen the global jet fleet grow around 4.5 times, and then you've seen the global passenger traffic measured in passenger revenue kilometres, so that's the passengers multiplied by how far they travel, has actually grown by 7.5 times. So that is a fundamental underpinning of our belief in the continued growth of this sector. And again, looking at the way the industry has performed, on this graphic you've got on one axis the growth of GDP and the ups and downs that you've seen through the growth cycle. And on the right-hand side, you see on a doubled index there of what the traffic growth has been. So broadly, traffic has grown by about double the level of GDP. And by and large, traffic hasn't actually fallen proportionately. So when GDP has gone down by 2%, you haven't seen a -4% in traffic. So there is a robustness to the level of traffic and indeed the level of recovery, even from disastrous events like September the 11th or SARS or the global financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis. The industry has proved itself time and again its ability to recover from those shocks. And this is a projection forward of the number of deliveries. So we're looking at being over 2,000 deliveries a year in that wide body, single aisle and regional jet market. And again, those projections do match with what's expected in terms of traffic growth. If you turn that into a value, and we're talking about the kind of base value rather than the value that you see on the manufacturer's advertising, so looking at the real value, you actually see going forward there's relatively few open slots. So that's one of the other things about when there are people within and outside the industry talking about, I can't understand how it can actually support that level of orders. What you're seeing is a complete change in the technology right the way across from regional jet to narrow body aircraft to wide body aircraft, that you're seeing step jumps in the technology. And it's very much like looking at the situation with iPhones. If you were to say, well, I can give you a really cheap iPhone 5 at the moment, I don't imagine anyone in this audience would suddenly get terribly excited about it. You need the new technology moving forward, and simply the old aircraft aren't going to be produced. So you're going to see this transition in which there is a push towards the new technology. So those new orders, that's the reason why there are so few slots available, is simply because the need for the technology, because if your competitor as an airline happens to have something that operates at 15 to 20% lower fuel burn than you do, you can guess who's going to win in the long run. So you absolutely have to have that new technology. So just a few points about the returns index. It's looking at tracking what's happened over the years in terms of performance. And so what you can do is put in portfolios and work out how well that they've done as well. And the assumptions that are put in tend to be conservative, but when we actually benchmark that against the actual performance of leasing companies, we find they can come out remarkably closely. And this is something that takes a while to absorb, but what we've done is go back in time to actually look all the way since 1980 at the returns that you've seen on a whole variety of different investments. And the Ascend Leasing Index is the one that's superimposed there in black, which is really giving you the feel for the reality, which is it's been a stable return over the period. And so it's this compromise between volatility and return. But if you look at the individual measures of how successful those particular investments have been over the last 10 years, and actually if you look in the top right hand corner at the Sharpe ratio, which is a coefficient derived from a mixture of the volatility and the return, you see that it way outperforms over that 2008 to 2018 period, the kind of basis that you are getting a return on. So, we would say that the Ascend Leasing Index does indicate that that sector has actually provided that stability of return. And the reasons for it, I think, are quite similar to the ones that Eddy was advancing. That what you're looking at is something that is diversified on a global basis. You've got an asset that is soluble around different applications, and you've got a gradually improving technology to both understand and to carry out financial transactions with that asset as well. And one of the issues that people always raise, because they'll have seen undoubtedly in the papers last week, another week, a month ago, 6 months ago, a failure of an airline, because they do tend to get treated in the press as a rather spectacular event. But actually when you look at the reality, this is something that's based on the aircraft. Eddy had a chart that was based on the number of airlines, but they tell basically the same story, that when you're looking at the default risk that's been involved, that what you've seen is, first of all, there's a relatively small proportion of those aircraft have come into scope. And secondly, in most of the cases, you've actually seen a different application of the asset. So you look at the Air Berlin aircraft, for example, in a very short space of time, even given the number of aircraft that were involved, those were able to be sold and leased out in different ways. So I think that again is a reinforcement for the confidence that you can have in this business. Now turning to the depreciation rate, this is an example for a 2013 aircraft, and looking back at the way that aircraft has performed depending on the number of years it had at that particular point. And so what you see is there are some times when the market value has been above that base value, and there's some times when it's been below. But again, there is a degree of stability that you can get about it, and you can understand that by looking at the data that we're able to provide. Because what we're looking at is the entire fleet and the database of values that we've got and the transactions that have taken place to understand what that variance is. I think another element is looking at the particular asset, and we've developed a basis, the aircraft ratings model which actually is looking at the ratings for that particular aircraft. And the events that we've seen, either external or internal or operational, do come into that rating as to a measure of what the interest is in the market in that particular aircraft type. So again, it's an element that gives you confidence in understanding that particular asset, because the key thing is the mobility of it. It's not just a question of that particular aircraft and its value in Indonesia. It's talking about that aircraft and its value right the way across the world. And there's also a way in which we can look at this in terms of the downside risk. So we use the historical volatility to estimate what the downside risk envelope actually is for individual aircraft types. And you do see that this varies quite significantly. So if you look at this mix between the return and the volatility, you do find that different assets perform differently. However, there is a concern that you need to look in detail, because if you're looking at those particular aircraft, you're seeing older types have got higher returns, and you may get excited about that, but you need at the same time to consider, first of all, the kind of historical transition that's taking place for those particular aircraft, and also the volatility that's involved. As Eddy mentioned, you've got those older aircraft will largely be tied up with a particular appreciation of what their maintenance status is and where they are, what the condition of the aircraft is. So you need to be careful in looking at these historical factors, because you need both to understand the overall asset and to understand the specific asset that you're dealing with. And similarly, you see on the mixture for wide bodies of return against volatility, this kind of variation. So you tend to find with this that the stability of the standard vanilla aircraft, the A320, the 737-800 and so on, will tend to give you lower returns, but undoubtedly will have lower volatility. So there's an element of you've got to decide what it is you want to choose. So the conclusions are that it's a long-term growth market, as you've heard from both of us, that the demand for aircraft is going to be strong over the next 20 years, that the airline failure rates, which have been a kind of press concern, in reality are being dealt with within both the overall business and within the financial community, and are relatively small and seem to continue to be that way. The aircraft is basically an asset with a stable and understood residual value, and again, you are not suddenly going to see new aircraft manufacturers pop up with a totally different product that will undermine the demand. You know, pretty much you've stabilised towards what one could call a duopoly, and it's going to stay that way for the foreseeable future. So there is a stability about the input on the supply side into the market. The returns for investing in aircraft have been proven to perform well, and as you saw from that other graphic, have a degree of stability that offers a lot compared with other forms of investment. Another advantage that aircraft have is they tend to be uncorrelated with other investments. So they're not correlated with the S&P 500 or the merchant shipping index or whatever. So it's that diversification is a definite advantage as well. So that's why I think both of us have sounded enthusiastic about the prospects of investing in aircraft. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morris, for your presentation. Our guests' questions, please. Yes. If you allow me, I will be going to the first who raised up hand first. So number one, number two.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan Vanya from a company which is Viltac, and we represent a company which tries to improve the existing aircraft, the retrofit technology, so to speak. And in your speech, you mentioned the importance of the new technologies. So I wonder whether you see the improvements on the existing fleet, like the retrofit technologies, more important than to bring to the market completely new aircraft, as we can see in case of narrow-body aircraft, that there are new aircraft coming to the market, or is it? I know it's not a black or white question, but is it better to improve the existing aircraft with the retrofit technologies, or bring to the market completely new aircraft?
I think you actually sort of answered your own question to some degree. I absolutely agree with you that it's not black and white, and that well, you only have to look at the air transport industry, because I remember a time when people said, well, low-cost carriers will never work in Europe because of this. Everyone agreed, everyone nodded, and then low-cost carriers worked in Europe. Similarly in Asia, low-cost carriers will never work in Asia. But I think my point about that is, it is an industry that tends to have got into its ways of believing there's one way and you converge towards that. And as you saw perhaps with IATA kind of standardizing things on behalf of the whole industry, then you had another industry called low-cost carriers that came along and actually undermined that. So I think that what you have to do is look at those situations in terms of the cost benefit and say, a new aircraft costs this and it does this and its performance is that. But actually, incremental changes can be just as effective in providing a cost benefit as well. So you're getting the Economist's answer, which is actually you need to look at the actual performance of what you're suggesting and saying what are the costs, what are the benefits, and sometimes it will actually be better than investing in new technology. So I think that, and you do see that one of the particular niches that you get within this industry is either leasing or selling older aircraft, that there is a demand for that in particular areas of the world for particular business models. And I'd be the last person in the world to say, no, that's the wrong thing to do, you need new equipment. I think there are specific things, but you've got to look at the costs and benefits of each of them.
Thank you. Question number 2.
Hello, Peter. Peter, Stephen Lyons from Silvernote Capital. We're in the process of setting up a Sharia aircraft investment fund. I'd just like to go back to your previous slide, now not the conclusions, the slide before that. And the A350-900, lovely aircraft, I've been on it a couple of times, but it seems to be a bit of an anomaly. Nice high returns, very low volatility.
Yeah.
Isn't that what we all want? But is that a function of the user base at the moment, that you're getting the higher returns? I mean,
this is terrible when people are answering their own questions. But you're absolutely right, it's sample size. It's a small sample size, and that's what's happened for the initial sample. So I think that number is going to move through time as you get a bigger sample. So I would say that one I would caution against because of that reason. It may well turn out that that's a possibility, but at the moment it's simply a sample size that's producing that effect, I would say.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Some more questions, please. We have 10 minutes. Yes, please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Matteo. I'm representing in Ireland. How does this all noise graphs and the aircrafts are growing, the numbers is growing, but how does the airport capacity will affect all this growing rate?
I think that's a very good point. The difficulty with that is you have, say, maybe 1,000 airports around the world. In fact, there's rather more than 1,000, but 1,000 of any kind of size. And they have different circumstances that are driven by their national authorities, whether it's privatised or whether it's corporatised or whether it's run by the government or the army. So you have different market situations for the infrastructure. You then add in the issues that you've got for the infrastructure in terms of air traffic management, an interface between air traffic management. It gets very complicated indeed to come out with, the answer is this. But without doubt, the growth of traffic has been faster in virtually all countries. I mean, there's some exceptions like China, for example, where in particular areas they've built infrastructure for the next 20 years. But even within China, you'll find in Shanghai and Beijing and so on, constraints on infrastructure. I think that there are definitely issues, and many of the people, for example, that have moved from operating A320s to A321s, one of the examples they come out with is that aircraft and the extra number of seats will allow a bit of a buffer against that kind of infrastructure problem. The trouble is, every different market has got a different issue at the individual airport and the airspace level. So I really can't generalise, but I absolutely agree with you that the problems of infrastructure tend to be forgotten when people are projecting forward growth at 4 or 5%. I mean, some of the manufacturers like Airbus, for example, do turn it to their advantage of saying, and therefore larger aircraft will be needed, and I think Boeing as well to some extent. But there isn't really a sort of international authority that's capable of dealing with all the issues, because someone like ICAO, which is a government organisation, finds it very difficult to kind of move anything forward because for every person that's in favour of something, someone else is against it. And I think it ultimately comes back to the individual countries believing in aviation and investing in aviation. And UAE is sort of a classic example of someone that's believed in aviation and carved out a niche in a way that people wouldn't have thought possible 30, 40 years ago. So I think there aren't that many enlightened governments, I'm afraid, around. They have other priorities, and so most of the major countries do have problems, particularly at hub airports.